Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Today's topic for Sunday Musings is whether there exists nepotism in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is a criticism that I've seen over the years from time to time. It bubbles up every now and again. This idea that there's kind of like connected families and hereditary cliques within church leadership. So I thought, let's dig into some data. Let's see what the actual situation is. But what is nepotism first? The basic dictionary definition of it is that it's a practice where among those with power or influence, they favor relatives, friends, or associates, especially by giving them jobs or putting them in positions of authority, using their power and influence to benefit someone that's close to them. I would argue that there's actually two forms of nepotism. There's direct nepotism, I'll call it, where it's the person in power or influence favoring their own relatives and friends, actively doing it themselves. I would also argue that there's this idea of indirect nepotism, namely that certain people are elevated to positions because of their connection to someone influential. So it's not necessarily that it's the influential person making the decision, but that, whether in a democracy or a government department or a church, if other deciders are favoring the people connected to their boss or the person in authority. So kind of this idea of indirect nepotism where other people are kind of promoting the elevation of individuals connected to the powerful or influential person. Now, of course, in the church context, this pertains to being called to a position of authority. Outside of the church context, there's, of course, a number of examples. I mean, you could look at the Bush dynasty or the Clinton dynasty. Of course, in politics, there's all kinds of examples of nepotism. Here's just a tiny smattering of what I found in like 30 seconds on social media. Here's Kamala Harris's husband leaving law firm for role in Biden administration. Of course, this was back in 2020. You've got Laura Trump is now co-chair of the RNC. This person says her only qualification is that she married Trump's son, just as Ivanka and Jared had zero qualifications for their significant portfolios in the White House. This is nepotism, plain and simple, and it's obscene. Of course, commentary from the people posting it, including Glenn Greenwald, who comes from the media. He's talking about the fusion of politics and media here with Meghan McCain, John McCain's daughter, calls it nepotism and dynastic privilege, which degrades culture. Speaking of culture, nepotism is a big issue in Hollywood media type circles. Here's Maya Hawke, daughter of two famous actors, recognizing that her nepotism has boosted her career opportunities. She says, I'm comfortable with not deserving it and doing it anyway. And then, sports. I'm not big into sports, but I thought I'd throw in a sports example. This guy is saying, I don't want to hear the charges, people talking about nepotism. The NBA is full of nepotism. The ownership level, front offices, coaching. I don't want to hear about it all of a sudden because Bronny James's father, LeBron James, plays for the Lakers. It's rampant in this league. So, again, a tiny smattering of examples across multiple industries, you could say, just to show that this is a prevalent problem in many places. Now, if it's your own business, like if you control something, then that's completely fine to, give it to a child or multiple children to pass it on to your heirs, right? When it's a business you control, that makes no sense. That's not really what we're talking about. That's certainly not how the church works, right? It's not the church of Joseph Smith or the church of Brigham Young or Russell Nelson or any of this kind of stuff, right? So we should see a big contrast. Now, I mentioned Joseph Smith. Let's go there and talk about this concept of bloodline in the church as it pertains to church leadership. So Joseph Smith, on a handful of occasions, taught, and you might say then even revealed, the concept of lineal succession. So in 1835, when in Kirtland, Joseph received the revelation that is now contained in section 107. Here's verse 40. The order of this priesthood was confirmed to be handed down from father to son, and rightly belongs to the literal descendants of the chosen seed, to whom the promises were made. Okay, so he's talking about the priesthood. This is a father to son right. It belongs to the literal descendants of the chosen seed. Of course, then the question is, how do you define chosen seed? We'll get into that in just a moment. 6 years later, when in Nauvoo, Joseph receives the revelation now recorded in section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Here's verses 57 and 58. For this anointing have I put upon his head, that his blessing shall also be put upon the head of his posterity after him. And as I said unto Abraham concerning the kindreds of the earth, even so I say unto my servant Joseph, in thee and in thy seed shall the kindred of the earth be blessed. Okay, so I would say that in the context of these two revelations, it's difficult to argue that Joseph Smith didn't anticipate that his sons would enter, church leadership. Quite the opposite, right? It seems clear from these revelations, right? In thy seed, Joseph, this kind of gives context to the earlier revelation about the chosen seed, right? In thy seed shall the kindred of the earth be blessed, talking about his posterity, the anointing upon them, just as with Abraham, so too with Joseph Smith. So it's clear to me that Joseph Smith did have this concept of lineal succession. Of course, this would become a major issue in the succession debates after the murder of Joseph Smith and Hiram and Sam. And something we don't talk about a lot. I have a musing about Samuel Smith waiting in the wings that I need to polish up and finish off. But after their death, then the succession crisis was, as I said, kind of a big to do, and then later, of course, Joseph Smith III makes claims, and you get what at the time was called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS Church, now Community of Christ. So it's very clear from these revelations that at least in some concept, Joseph Smith was kind of in favor of and saying, revealed from the Lord, here's this idea of lineal succession. This, of course, was not a far-fetched idea. It's contained throughout the Old Testament. You look certainly at Adam, of course, when you only have one family, it makes sense that you're going to pass things down that line. But after Adam, priesthood continues through a patriarchal line. Seth, Enos, Enoch, Noah, Melchizedek, eventually Abraham. Abraham passes the priesthood to Isaac, who passed it to Jacob or Israel, and so on. So the lineage reflects this father-to-son pattern. It's always dependent, of course, on worthiness and divine approval. It's not just this rubber stamp that the kids are going to get it. Not all descendants, of course, receive the mantle. Only those, that were chosen, that prove faithful. So it's not an automatic thing, but it is clear that to the extent that there's righteous sons, that's how this was transmitted. We can look at the Book of Mormon. Of course, you see all kinds of prophetic father-to-son relationships there. I mean, not just father to son, but family members as well. You've got Nephi consecrating his younger brothers, Jacob and Joseph, to be priests and teachers over the people. From Jacob, we go to Enos to Jerem, Jerem to Omni and Ammoron. From Ammoron, it goes to his brother Chemish. And this is, they're passing the records and the Liahona and all this stuff, and kind of the prophetic scribes, going down this line. That's not to say there were no priesthood holders outside of this line per se, but you definitely see this same kind of relationship. You go to Mosiah, and then to his son Benjamin, and then to this Mosiah the younger, splits over to Alma, outside of the kind of chain of command, the familial chain of command. But then from Alma the senior, it goes to Alma the younger, then to Helaman, then Shiblon, his brother, briefly, and then back to Helaman the second, and then Nephi. So you get like this, Alma senior kind of resurrecting this lineal succession, at least of the kind of prophetic mantle and record keeping. Even though it was kind of the sidestep from Mosiah, and there was a little bit of a rigmarole at some point. Let's give an example of a modern revelation. Let's go to section 68, where it says, and if they be literal descendants of Aaron, they have a legal right to the bishopric, if they are the firstborn among the sons of Aaron. For the firstborn holds the right of the presidency over this priesthood and the keys or authority of the same. a few verses later, but by virtue of the decree concerning their right of the priesthood, descending from father to son, they may claim their anointing if at any time they can prove their lineage or do ascertain it by revelation from the Lord under the hands of the above named presidency. So this isn't just an invention of Joseph Smith. This is something with a clear pattern in Scripture. This idea of lineal succession / familial succession, in a sense, where you've got, going over to a brother and so forth. The chosen seed, right? You get the kind of the righteous posterity that, if you interpret that term broadly, then perhaps there's room for the Almas of the world and others where you didn't have the chain going straight from father to son always. Of course, sons and grandsons and great-grandsons have their agency. And it may be that some of them, all of them at a certain point are like, nope, I don't want to have anything to do with this. In which case you would, ostensibly need other links in the chain. So maybe it's more of a familial succession. And again, in the Book of Mormon, we're more talking about the prophetic mantle and the record keeping. Although that's relevant for the musing, because here I'm not talking about church membership broadly and how priesthood is disseminated through the ranks. We're talking specifically about church leadership. Therefore, I think it's germane to talk about the kind of prophet leaders throughout the Book of Mormon. So let's get into that. The bloodlines, the lineal succession type ideas within the modern church. Of course, on a topic like this, one is theologically obligated to quote J. Golden Kimball, who was a member of the 70. He was in the Quorum of the 70. He was Heber C. Kimball's son. So Heber Kimball's son, Uncle Golden Kimball, J. Golden, said the following, and I quote, keep in mind this is a quote, "Some people say a person receives a position in this church through revelation, and others say they get it through inspiration. But I say they get it through relation. If I hadn't been related to Heber C. Kimball, I wouldn't have been a damn thing in this church." Oh, that guy. He's got a bunch of fun quotes. So here's a member of the 70, himself connected to Heber, making the point, right? Like, hey, there's something here to the fact that I'm related, and therefore, I was called over to this. Okay, so my little research for this one is not, this is not exhaustive. This is not statistically accurate. This is a deep anecdotal dive throughout lots of examples just to surface some of these examples for conversation. So I went through and I started looking up all kinds of data points about examples where you've got a father-son or a familial type of connection in church leadership. So not just son, I also included like sons-in-law, and then of course, brothers. There's even like a couple cousins in here. Now, what I'm looking at, because I have to draw lines somewhere, is I'm only looking at the Quorum of the 12 / First Presidency and the General Authority 70s. So not all the lower quorums of the 70s who aren't full-time. I'm not looking at, temple presidents, like was a apostle's son called to be a temple president. I'm not looking at any of that, though there are examples. But again, I don't want this to be a 4-hour musing. I didn't look at mission presidents. I mean, there's a number of those, like, President Hinckley, his son Clark was called to be mission president. Boyd Packer, his son-in-law David Bullock. You got M. Russell Ballard, his son-in-law Bradford Brower, Henry Eyring, his son, Henry Johnson. You've got some other stuff in there, again, that I'm like not covering in this list, like Thomas Monson, when his daughter Ann Dibbs was called into the Young Women's General Presidency. We're not looking at the Patriarch office. That was a lineal succession, clearly from Joseph Smith Sr. Until it wasn't. I might do a future musing on that office and its implications, but you had the Smith family all the way down to Eldred Smith in like 1979 when the church gave him Patriarch Emeritus status and put him out to pasture, and under the guise of like, we have stake patriarchs now, we don't really need the office anymore. So we're not looking at all the, the auxiliaries, the mission presidents. I gotta draw the line somewhere, so they're not being included in this. So again, apostle, general authority, 70. Not the local area 70s. I mean, there's examples like Dallin Oaks' son-in-law is an area 70, or Garrett Gong was an area 70, and he was the son-in-law to Richard Lindsay, who was in the second quorum of the 70. And so there's lots of other connections like that for people who kind of got their start in the lower quorum. So what I present to you, again, is not exhaustive. In fact, there was plenty more to do, but I've been very busy, and I felt like what I'm about to share is sufficient to illustrate the point, and it didn't need to be perfectly comprehensive and go through everything. So I will leave it up to some future researcher to dig in and have a concrete, thorough examination of this topic. Let's share just some examples. You can see in my table here on the left-hand side, it's who is the elder relative and that person's position, and then who is the younger relative, that individual's relation to the older person, and then what position was he called into. So again, we'll just go through some examples. You've got Boyd Packer. He's president of the Quorum of the 12. His son, Alan Packer, is called into the 70, just like 2 months, or rather he's sustained 2 months after President Packer starts as president of the Quorum of the 12. Gordon Hinckley, his son Richard becoming a 70. You've got Russell Nelson, who, while in the Quorum of the 12, his son-in-law Michael Ringwood gets called into the 70. You've got Merlin Libert, who was in the 70. His son-in-law Dale Renland called into the 70, now the Quorum of the 12. Melvin J. Ballard, Quorum of the 12. His son M. Russell Ballard called into the 70, then the Quorum of the 12. He's also, by the way, grandson of Hiram Max Smith, and who's an apostle, son of Joseph F. Smith, brother of Joseph Fielding Smith. So there's connections there beyond just his dad, Melvin J. Ballard. They're coming from the kind of the Smith family line. You got Richard Lindsay, who's in the 70. I mentioned his son-in-law, Garrett Gong, becomes in the 70, now Quorum of the 12. You've got Alonzo Hinckley, Quorum of the 12. His nephew, Gordon Hinckley, was called first as an assistant to the Quorum of the 12, and then into the Quorum of the 12, then, of course, as president. We go way back for Amasa Lyman, who was an apostle, Quorum of the 12. His son, Francis Lyman, gets called into the Quorum of the 12. Interestingly, Amasa was excommunicated later for heresy. He joined the Godbeite faction. He was posthumously reinstated after his death as a church member and as an apostle by Joseph F. Smith, who was persuaded that the dude was mentally ill. So Amasa, longtime apostle, gets exed, gets brought back, restored his priesthood blessings and so forth after he's dead. So his son, Francis, is in the Quorum of the 12. That son, Francis, his son, Richard Lyman, gets called into the Quorum of the 12. Richard also gets excommunicated for adultery. He was basically pursuing polygamy in his late 60s, 70s. His wife at the time that he was excommunicated, was the Relief Society general president. And so his grandpa had been excommunicated for apostasy, heresy, and he get excommunicated for chasing another lady. Interesting. Anthony Ivins, first counselor in the first presidency, his son, Antoine, gets called to the 70. Now, Brigham Young is president of the church. His son, Brigham Jr., gets called to the Quorum of the 12. Other sons, John, Willard, and Joseph, are also called as apostles, but not in the Quorum of the 12. So John was privately ordained by his father, Brigham Young, when he was 11. There's no public announcement. There's no adding him to the Quorum of the 12. And then later, John's ordination gets reconfirmed in 1864 when his brothers, who I just mentioned, Brigham Jr. and Joseph, were ordained apostles by their father. But none of them became members of the Quorum of the 12 upon their ordination because the quorum already had 12 members. So Brigham Jr. later gets in, but John and Joseph were just called to be apostles when they were young, and they had that kind of status, but were not members of the quorum. kind of random, interesting. You got Dallin Oakes, second counselor, first presidency. His brother Merrill Oakes in the 70. President Oakes was a longtime apostle in 1998 by that time when his brother was called. You've got David Haight in the Quorum of the 12. His son-in-law, John Huntsman Sr., gets called to the 70. David McKay, President McKay, his nephew, George Hills, gets called to the 70. This is 17 years after David's death. So again, it's not always direct, quote unquote, nepotism, favoritism, whatever word you want to use. There's also this indirect idea where people just have elevated status because of, who they're connected to, it would seem. You've got Ezra T. Benson, who was an apostle. Of course, his great-grandson, Ezra Taft, gets called as an apostle and then as president of the church. Here's another multi-generational connection. You've got Franklin D. Richards, Quorum of the 12. His son, George Richards, also called into the Quorum of the 12. The senior, this Franklin, the dad, was nephew of Willard Richards, who's Brigham Young's cousin. So these connections are still happening. So you got Franklin down to George, and then George, his son, LeGrand Richards, gets called into the Quorum of the 12. So another connection. Franklin D. Richards' grandson, also called Franklin Richards, gets called to the 70. You've got George A. Smith. He's the first counselor of the first presidency. Here we go, another multi-generational one. Of course, we're dealing with the Smiths. You've got the son, John Henry Smith, who's called into the Quorum of the 12, and then the first presidency becomes the second counselor. George A.'s dad was John, who was Joseph Smith's uncle, so Joseph Sr.'s younger brother. So the son, John Henry Smith, his son is George Albert Smith, who was called to the Quorum of the 12 and then the president. So we got some Smith connections. You've got George Q. Cannon, first counselor of the first presidency. Two of his sons, Abraham and Sylvester, are called into the Quorum of the 12. Of course, we know Heber Kimball, his son, Jay Golden, who very colorfully highlighted the familial connection. He also had a grandson, namely Spencer W. Kimball, called to the Quorum of the 12 and then the president. Heber Grant, his cousin Anthony Ivins, was called into the Quorum of the 12. His grandson, George Cannon, was a 70. John Taylor, president of the church, his son, John W. Taylor, called in the Quorum of the 12. We've talked about him. He later got apostatized, later excommunicated because he was doubling down on polygamy when the church was trying to backtrack. Joseph F. Smith, president of the church, right? You've got his son, Joseph Fielding Smith, called into the Quorum of the 12. You've got Hiram M. Smith, called into the Quorum of the 12. So again, all these Smith connections, which one might argue is kind of a chosen seed example playing out in all these instances. Now, again, I'm going to cut it there. There's more. This is not comprehensive. This just shows you, what's easily discoverable and frequently happening. Not mentioned are non-church positions that are still heavily influenced by church members, like the Board of Regents hiring Elder Holland's son for the job at UVU to be president UVU, or, you got more distant lineage, like Quentin Cook is the great-grandson of Heber Kimball. So lots of other stuff that is not mentioned, but you kind of get the point, and you can infer that from what I've shared, there's much more, and maybe much, much more. Some statistics for this, again, mostly for lack of time, and also I didn't have the energy to try and do deep analysis on my own. I threw it over to Grok, and I asked for some heavy lifting on some of the statistical examples here. So according to the AI bot, I was trying to follow all of its calculations. They seemed right, but again, it's take this for what it is. According to its review of the data, 8 of 17 church presidents have documented family connections. So that's 47%, roughly half of presidents of the church have these family connections to a previous general authority leader of the church. For the apostles, it's 21 out of just over 100 individuals who have been called as apostles who have documented family connections to prior general authorities. So that's around 20%. Now, how much more likely than random chance is it that these individuals are being called? So for church presidents, again, according to my friend Grok, church presidents are 78 times more likely to have a general authority family connection than would be expected by chance. If you just took, what's the odds that anyone could then make their way to become member of the church? For apostles, they're 36 times more likely to have general authority family connections than expected by chance. I think I said that wrong. It's not the statistical likelihood of a random member becoming a church leader. It's how likely is it that the person who is called would have a family member that was previously a general authority. That's the right way to say it. So for church presidents, they're 78 times more likely, according to Grok. Apostles are 36 times more likely than what you would expect by chance to have a previous family member in a position of authority in the church. Okay, some concluding thoughts here. Early on, when the church was small, it would make sense that the small membership base of the church and its concentrated geographical, location, its footprint, meant that leadership would come from a limited pool of founding families, individuals who were there since the beginning. Polygamy introduced also creates this complex set of family networks where all of a sudden you've got all kinds of people connected to one another through these increased interconnections, especially when you had church leaders among the most prolific in taking multiple wives, therefore creating lots more kids who have lots more cousins who marry lots more people and so forth. So you get a lot more of these connections. The church then expanding beyond Utah, those family connections stay strong, possibly due to continued geographic concentration in the, Utah corridor here, and the prominence, you might call it, of pioneer families and that heritage, even just culturally. I mean, that carries weight, right? Fast forward to today, you've got, despite global expansion, family connection rates, I think, remain high. I think the data shows they remain high among top leadership despite having this global church, suggesting that even though there's a much larger pool to draw from, you still have this kind of favoritism or bias towards these established networks. Now, you don't see as many relatives being called as general authorities today, but you also have like longtime church employees or other well-connected members of the church getting called to positions as well. In a few months ago, I feel like, when I did the musing on different professions of people in the church, there were a lot of church employees, right? You have, people who came from the church's education system who were, professors or ran universities. And so these individuals are kind of well known to church leadership, and them getting called, even if they may have no family connection of their own, shows perhaps that this is more about who you know, not necessarily who you're related to. So who you're related to means you know them well, means they're kind of maybe more top of mind when you're making a calling or deciding things. But there are plenty of people in other positions of influence who you know, where you have that kind of pool of candidates to draw from. If you're a bishop or a stake president, no doubt you're more likely to call someone you know rather than some random member whose name the Spirit just gives you out of nowhere, right? And so people, I think, often kind of default or are biased towards the people in their network, which I think is why we see this reinforced even in a global church. I think that's just kind of part of the human condition, that you kind of, much like in a high school clique or whatever, you're going to kind of go down that path of least resistance of the people that you're familiar with. You could argue, super tongue-in-cheek, that that general authorities have extremely high midichlorian counts, right? Like, these favored individuals that have the special blood, they're the chosen seed, right? Like, okay, we don't buy anything. We don't buy into that. And in all seriousness, I think there are some possible explanations for why we see patterns the way they are. So one might be that like preparation and training. So if you're growing up in a family where there's a general authority, maybe you've got like more spiritual preparation, leadership training. You're following dad to his meetings. I don't know, right? But like you're in the home of someone who's trying maybe that much harder to really be in tune with the spirit, and is talking about how all this works. He's introducing you to people. You're getting the special seats at general conference, and you're there with families of other, like, you're just kind of in that network, right? Another factor might be visibility. Family members of leaders are more likely to be known to decision makers. Again, it's not necessarily who you're related to, it's who you know, or at least that's an influence in this, right? Just because of the way our brains work. You've got the geographic concentration argument. So many decisions are made by leaders familiar with Utah area families. Again, it's more just your network, and that's if this is where the headquarters is and the concentration of leadership and meetings and all of that, you're naturally going to get these networks emerging from a tighter knit community, even if you have members all over the world. You could argue, by contrast, that it's divine providence, that this is God working through family lines similar to biblical patterns, right? And it doesn't necessarily always have to be family or father to son, just like it wasn't always in scriptural history, but that you kind of have this default to family lines and chosen seed of righteous families. So if you want to broadly interpret and construe that outside of, I think, the narrower context that God was intending it in his revelations to Joseph Smith, more power to you. I think it's an interesting argument. All of this for me, like, I kind of don't care too much. This is more of a curiosity, just because I've seen criticisms and questions online in the past, and allegations of, insider, whatever. And like, I think the surface level data that I've shared makes very clear that there are a number of connections like this. And does that mean that in every single instance it was God's specific will that family member be the one out of all the other righteous, worthy people who could have been called? I'm going to say that's probably a little bit more human bias coming in when you see the preference given towards people's own posterity or family connections. I can't say that about every case, but I think there's enough of them to suggest that perhaps we've had a little bit of that going on. That doesn't mean it's inherently problematic. Again, look at the scriptures and you have this happening again and again and again. You've got modern revelation talking about, at least in concept and in context of Joseph Smith, the idea of lineal succession, the idea of working through chosen seed, again, undefined. We can infer what that means. I don't know. I'd be curious to get your thoughts. Again, this is not intended to be comprehensive. Grok may have gotten some of the math wrong. I don't know. It's more just a curiosity to go down the rabbit hole a little bit, look into some of these family connections, find a whole bunch of them, many more that I didn't share, and then just muse on, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to you? I'd love to know in the comments. To me, it doesn't seem like too big a deal. We've got scriptural examples. It's kind of natural based on human networks and the way these things go. It does maybe call into question the divine providence of every single calling, always and forever. Maybe it doesn't, though, again, because of the scriptural examples. So I don't want to say indifferent on this one, but I'm maybe unsettled or don't have a firm point of view here. Maybe the data is of interest to you. I'm sure you've heard this allegation or question before. Let me know in the comments what you think. What did I miss? What am I getting wrong? Should I have a firm position one way or the other? I will see you in the comments. I'll see you next week.